Alrighty, well, why don't we get started? Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning. I'm Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest. We're delighted to have this session today. I won't give a long explanation of, why the Baltic and Nordic and Arctic regions are important, because I kind of assume that everybody who's here is interested in that. And I'm generally a believer in keeping my own comments as short as possible on occasions like this, since it's Tom who everyone is here to listen to. So thank you very much for being with us. We're really delighted to have Tom Sanderson, who I think we met probably 10 or 15 years ago at this point. I don't remember exactly. And, Tom, of course, for quite some time leading the Transnational Threats Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I think and now, of course, in the consulting business, and from what I understand, a very successful consulting business. So congratulations on that. But someone who I always felt was and is a really smart, thoughtful, and practically minded person. And that's what we're all about here at the Center for the National Interest. So we're really delighted to have Tom here, and thankful that all of you were able to take a little bit of time out of your day to be with us. So we're on the record, right, Tom?
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So we will start with, 7, 8, 10 minutes from Tom, and then just move into a general conversation.
Great.
Please.
Thank you, Paul.
Please.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
And thank you, everyone, for coming. Very happy to be here, and glad to see my friend Melinda Herring is here, who is a Ukraine mentor of mine. And that's
And Melinda, you can, there's some space. All right. All right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I blew your cover of my comments. But yeah, thank you very much, and also thank you to Dr. Andy Cutchins, who I think introduced us originally.
Right.
And,
Right.
Andy's a Russia file mentor of mine. My background is in transnational threats, as Paul said. I'm not a Russia expert, but I operate globally. I have actually done field work in 80 plus countries. I've been on the ground in so many places, um, part of which is to populate, update, and sharpen my core consulting presentation, which is known as Global Disruptive Forces, that looks at everything from great power friction to terrorism, food, water, energy, pandemics, technology, migration. And in order to strengthen that presentation, among other goals, I conduct 3 to 4 visits a year, generally through embassies, through the cooperation of embassies, to countries to engage 20 or so people in nations that are in the middle of or adjacent to critical issues in critical countries. And Finland is clearly one of those. While I was at CSIS for 16 years running the Transnational Threats Project, I went out to 60 plus countries for that particular job to engage, again, a wide spectrum of sources on terrorism. But while I was there, I would pick up a lot of perspective on geopolitics. And that allowed me in 2005 to create this presentation, which I took full time along with teaching at the National Security Agency, where I taught for 18 years. Um, and so I like to go out there. As Paul said, I'm very practically minded. I like to hear what a spectrum of people say, bring it back, and put it in front of audiences like this: diplomats, analysts, current and former state, DoD, congressional, media, private sector folks, and hear what you think and try to add to the conversation. So to the Finland visit, and you'll see a few pictures here. There are no content slides. None of my findings are on the slides. These are largely just pictures from what I saw while I was there. But my partner Eden Beck and I arrived in Finland just a couple days after the Greenland blow up and President Trump's comments about NATO troops not fighting on the front lines in Afghanistan and Iraq. So that hung very heavily over the discussions while we were there. But the Finns were perfectly polite, but there was an unmistakable chill in the air about America's commitment to NATO and our overall role in global security. I mean, that was the intent. You all remember it just 3, 4 weeks ago. That was really the biggest flare up in our relationship at the point. And as you also know, and as you can see here from a picture I took, Finland has NATO's longest border with Russia. And after being under Russian rule as a Grand Duchy for 109 years and achieving independence in 1917, they endured an invasion by the Red Army, Winter War. I got a nice tour of some of the sites there while I was in Sala. And then, of course, was under immense pressure from the Soviets during the Cold War. So Finland certainly does not need any convincing as to the degree and nature of the threat coming from Moscow. The purpose of the visit, I wanted to understand Finland's point of view on Ukraine, Russia's war on Ukraine, Arctic security, NATO, U.S. foreign policy. I also wanted to get firsthand exposure to the joint Finland, US, Canada icebreaker Arctic security cutter program, which while I was there was 99% of the way there. And I think it is now sealed, but I'm not certain. But this is to build 11 icebreakers for the US Coast Guard, some of them being built there in Finland at Rauma Marine Construction, and then some of them being built in Mississippi and Louisiana. This also involves the Department of Labor, Massachusetts Maritime Academy to send um, folks from the Coast Guard, from Mass Maritime, and others over there to train on operating icebreakers, on building icebreakers. So this is about bringing some of the Finnish shipbuilding skill to the United States. And where I visited, Rauma Marine Shipbuilding, you'll see on the map, they've been building ships for over 500 years, and this is a country that knows what it's doing. So I wanted to better understand that. This is all coming on the heels of multiple engagements with the Embassy of Finland, with starting with Mikko Hautala a couple of years ago, and now with Lena Kesa, Mikola, who's been just fantastic in helping me pull off this trip. And I also wanted to go to the border with Finland, as you saw there, to get a sense of what it was like there. I've been on lots of hot borders or cold, but you know, possibly hot borders over the years, and that's been very valuable to me. Just you see the background there in my recent field work. I've spent a lot of time on the perimeter of Russia. I've made several visits in the past to Russia, and I have a heavy duty exposure now to Ukraine. And last summer, taught at the Kyiv School of Economics, thanks to Melinda's initial engagement with me on that topic. So I taught my presentation as a full semester course at KSE, and that has been super valuable. So who did I meet with while I was there? Active duty military officers, including the commander of the Urban Combat Brigade, who was fantastic. And then shipbuilding executives, you know, spent the whole day at Rauma, which is the arrow at the bottom left, west of Helsinki, which is the bottom right arrow. Rovaniemi is the vertical arrow there. That's where the forward land forces uh, contingent is based. And then I went up to Sodankala, uppermost arrow there. And then on the right, that little bulge pushing inward to Finland is Sala, and that is where I visited the border post with the Lapland border guards. So those are the various places that I went. I met former MFA officials, Office of the Presidential Officials, the director for the Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, a range of consultants who are working on Russia's war in Ukraine, the Reuters bureau chief, National Defense University scholars, some of whom were reservists, some who are active duty, working on Russia and China. One of them working on Russia has every single data point on Russia's military positions along the border and what they're doing to prepare for a return to previous levels of force levels along the border. which they estimate anywhere from 5 to 15 years away, depending on, of course, how things unfold in Ukraine, among other issues. And then finally, I met with a woman who's the leading scholar on Finland's philosophy and trait embodying resilience in the face of challenge, known as Sisu. And you may have seen an article in The Economist a few months ago talking about Sisu, in which they interviewed Dr. Lati. And I met her at the new Udi Modern Library in Helsinki, which was really quite a beautiful place. And we talked about this philosophy and this trait and how it plays into Finland's preparation for conflict, and just the resilience of society and the military. And on that note, let me commend to you an outstanding documentary film by Johnny Harris, who is a documentary filmmaker and journalist on YouTube. He has 8 million followers. He was at CSIS and then he went to Vox Media. He won an Emmy for one of his doc films, and he produced a 50-minute film of him going on maneuvers with Finnish army, and then engaging citizens, going through the underground tunnels. It is a outstanding doc film, and I would suggest that you take a look at that if you have not seen it. Some of the discussion points, and again, I recognize there are people in here who know much more than I do about Russia and Ukraine, and some of these are not new issues, but they're certainly still on the table for discussion when I was in Finland. And one of those, of course, is the preparation to rebuild forces along the border and NATO's response. Some of them already underway, some of them really in the beginning stages. The forward land forces, as I mentioned, up at Rovaniemi, Arctic Sentry, which was announced just a couple of weeks ago, which really is a structure to bring shape to the various exercises that are happening in the region, and also partly to tamp down some of the tensions that emerged over President Trump's comments on Greenland. And then Norway's Combined Air Operations Center, among others, are all critical elements of maintaining watch and readiness in the high north and on NATO's north and eastern flank. And so it was great to hear different perspectives on these. Instrumentalized migration, not a new issue, but something that is still very much on the minds of the Finns, 2015 and 16, and then again 2023, where the Russians pushed asylum seekers to the border. There is a 30-mile security zone inside of Russia. You do not end up on the Finnish border unless the Russian government had a hand in it. And so these people with very little clothing on bicycles sitting at the Finnish border, designed to push them in and generate the internal friction that we saw in Germany in 2015. That failed, and the border is now closed, well, partly because of the war, but also due to the instrumentalized migration by the Russians. Hybrid warfare, of course, was a major topic. I've visited the Center of Excellence. I'm sure many of you have been there and you know the program. All NATO and all EU countries are member of this Center of Excellence. I talked to the executive director there. Some countries are doing more than others. Of course, those closer to Russia and the ones enduring the attacks, the bombs put on DHL planes at various industrial parks in Poland, dragging of the anchors, the propaganda, the undermining of elections, disinformation, all of these things are in arrows in the Russian quiver for hybrid warfare. And so that came up quite a bit. And I know we have a representative from the Embassy of Estonia here. On February 11, I gave a talk to Ambassador Prek Mikola, the DCM from the Czech Republic, from Czechia, and the Polish Milat, among others, to talk about some of these hybrid threats. And of course, there's really no doubt as to who is pulling these off. And you may have also seen the recent New York Times article about the taxi driver who was, playing an individual role in some of these attacks. And so that was big on the topics. How am I doing on time?
We're a little bit
Okay.
pushing it, but that's okay.
Let me just mention
Okay.
the icebreakers. You know about the icebreaker gap. The U.S. has generously three, we're calling them icebreakers, really two. In the Arctic Security Cutter program, you see the picture here of the proposed Rauma program, would get us a little closer to Russia's 42 certified icebreakers. They have another 8 to 10 ice-capable ships. 8 of their 42 are nuclear powered, and so this would in one of them you see there, this program with Finland and Canada would get us closer. We have a 300,000 worker skills gap in shipbuilding in the US. The gap with China on shipbuilding is well known. Um, Finland's comprehensive security program, I heard this from every single person I met there. 7 elements: psychological resilience, leadership, international and EU activities, defense capability, internal security, economy, infrastructure, and security of supply, functional capacity of the population and services. This is the foundation of their societal resilience. Ice breaking comes from that notion of resilience. They're highly dependent on imports. They have frozen harbors. So having a icebreaker capacity is really important to them. They're always thinking about what could happen in the future, but they have a broad perspective on threats: Russia, climate change, terrorism, pandemics, etc. I will close it there and open it up to comments and questions.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I think very broad overview there to get us started, brought up really a lot of different issues. So I think as people have questions or comments here, it can go in a lot of different directions, but let's just kind of open it up. And please identify yourself when you ask a question, make a comment. Mark.
Marquette, George Mason University, also affiliated with the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Russians are doing with regard to Svalbard? I've seen some Russian commentary about um, sort of like playing off of uh, U.S. government or Trump administration rhetoric about Greenland, that they want to do the sort of the same thing for Svalbard, if you will, to somehow rescue it from nefarious efforts. I don't know how serious these are. You know, you have a lot of nationalist scholars who just say "damn all," but I'm wondering if you could talk about what the Russians are actually doing with regard to Svalbard.
I will tell you, it did not come up in the discussions, and I'm happy to have anyone else here, um, answer your question. So that did not come. It was much more about what was happening right over the border. So if anyone has a comment on Svalbard, please feel free to inject here.
From the Norwegian
Yeah, yeah,
embassy.
please.
Yeah.
So I'm Torken Survik with the Embassy of Norway. It's a big topic. I just wanted to make two main points. First of all, Svalbard is part of Norway. It's just as Norwegian as any other part of Norway, so that's one. Second, uh, Svalbard is not demilitarized. So under the Svalbard Treaty, uh, there is well, nobody is allowed to establish permanent fortifications on Svalbard. But other than that, it is part of Norway will be defended as part of Norway as part of the NATO AOR. So yeah, those are two really basic points. Beyond that, there is of course Russian presence on Svalbard. They are prodding us in various ways. They have been doing that for decades. That's just an ongoing process. Um, but the situation has not really changed in a fundamental way lately. Um, yeah, it's a long discussion, so I'd be happy to go into more detail, but those are the headlines.
But again, I would note it did not come up in any of the dozen discussions they had there. I mean, look, we there were so many things to discuss, but Svalbard did not come up. It's much more, as I said, along what was happening over the border and the monitoring of the rebuilding of facilities, not a major movement of forces onto the border, but the rebuilding of the facilities, new capabilities, and just sort of trying to think through what the reintroduction and repositioning of Russian forces along the border would mean for Finland. Next question, please.
Melinda.
Tom, did you have any discussions about what Finland is learning from the war in Ukraine? Are they talking about drones? Are they talking about electronic warfare? What are they getting from it? If they would tell you.
Yeah, great question. And no doubt about it, as all others are, to varying degrees of impact, getting lessons from Ukraine and electronic warfare, jamming, drone development, what to do about armor. You know, a couple of years ago, I met the representative of Patria, the armored vehicle maker in Finland, and I tried to meet them while I was over there. I did not have time, but I wanted to engage them and say, what are you doing in the face of this unbelievable threat? The British report that just came out this week said that 4,000 tanks and 10,000 plus Russian pieces of armor, apart from tanks, armored vehicles, have been destroyed in the war. Of course, some by other armor, but a lot of them by drones. And so the Finns clearly see this. The Finns have strengths in electronic warfare. And so that definitely came up in this idea of working with Ukraine to be able to generate an enhanced drone capability. It's one of those things. Just this morning, a leading U.S. investor in drone capabilities in Ukraine via the Danes contacted me and asked me a similar question. He said, can you tell me about Finland's investment appetite for this? And so it is on the minds of people who are heavy duty into the issue. And I think the Finns, given their technical capabilities, would be excellent partners to work with Ukraine. But everyone should be doing this. I am just incredibly shocked and dismayed by the fact that we are not going heavier into this. And Melinda, I brought over a drone company founder to DC just a couple months ago after my October visit. I had 15 people in the room, including you, to discuss, what their efforts and interests were. And there were no export license offered yet, but they wanted to get a sense of what the landscape was of opportunity. And going back to your initial comment, practicality here, we should absolutely be moving forward with this. Russia's military is certainly badly damaged. They will reconstitute it at some point, but where they really lead is in drones. We tend to forget this. We're looking at how good Ukraine is, but Russia is also excellent in drones, and they've got the world's biggest factory and supplier for drone and drone parts. This drone rep that you and I had lunch with, among a dozen others, was telling me in his office how he was working to lower from 70% to 50, and he was down to something like 25% Chinese content in drones. And it was US, German, Israeli, British content that was, taking up the slack. But we should, wholesale be working with the Ukrainians, because the Russians are going to emerge with this exceptional capability. On that topic, let me just bring up something else that came up while I was there. A couple of people brought up the issue of what happens to all of this talent after the war. Now, I'm not sure if I have the exact name of the organization. It's something like the Institute for International Organized Crime or something like that, put out a report on the potential for Ukrainian and Russian soldiers going into the ranks of organized crime groups following the war, in a environment beset by destabilization, flush with money coming in, lots of arms, incredible skills, and what might happen to the Russians and Ukrainians and the international fighters who are there as well, who could take up positions in some of these organized crime groups. What I was hearing from the Finns was, well, what about all the drone operators too, going to, anyone who wants to increase their military's capability, their criminal group's capability, whatever it was. And that also is something of concern that the Finns brought up in the discussion.
I'm going to go, I'll come to others here in a second. I'm going to go a little bit sideways off of that with a comment and a question. The comment is for people who are interested in the drone stuff. Our board of directors member, General Glenn Van Herk, who was the commander of NORAD, 4-star retired Air Force general. I think he retired a couple of years ago, wrote a piece for our national interest recently where he was talking about the drone threat to the United States. I found it alarming because he was kind of walking through the sort of varying federal departments and agencies that have jurisdiction over different elements of that problem as a matter of homeland security. As one might suspect, it's a mess. It's a mess. That's one to reflect on.
Yeah.
Sort of turning from that direction, and of course we had this whole flap. Many may remember recently in Texas of the airspace being
El
shut
Paso,
down,
yep.
and so I'm kind of bringing it up very much in that context. So Finland has this really long border. A lot of it with Russia. A lot of it is incredibly isolated, cold,
It was
terrible.
-30 while I was there. -30.
What a fun visit!
Yeah, I actually love cold.
What a fun visit. But remote, cold, everything else. What's the technological solution? Because I assume it's not putting like one guard every 100 meters along the border.
Exactly.
What's the solution to that problem?
Well,
How are they approaching it?
it came up often. They didn't home in on any particular solution for it. They know the threat is there. They know, Ukraine is going to make 7 million drones this year. The Russians more than that. They know it is a swarming capability that the Russians could put over the border for any number of points of attack and tactics. Um, but the concerns and the potential solutions that were brought up in discussions are, of course, jamming, counter drone operations, anything from netting. But you can't. This is a 1,340-kilometer border, and so again, the advantage right now is with the drone operators and not the counter drone operators.
Right.
It's just
Right.
much easier to be able to be on the offensive with drones than to be on the defensive.
Okay, we had, I think, one here
Yeah.
and then one here.
Very briefly, let me just name that
that
organization I was talking about because it's a great report. It's the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime that came up with a report, The Future of Organized Crime Beyond the Russian-Ukrainian War.
And this is Michael Blahos.
Yeah, Michael Blahos. We've come a long way from the Mannerheim line, and I'm interested in how we're conceptualizing scenarios for intensified hybrid warfare in a theater like Finland. I mean, we've had some discussion, at least publicly, I've seen some about Latvia and Estonia, and there's a lot of talk about the Slovakia gap and all that, but there are many issues in terms of what we might imagine would be a high-stress, aggressive situation along the Finnish border. And coming into play with that, of course, is the extent to which defense relations between Finland and Sweden have evolved since the accession into NATO, and what the implications are for Finland of that kind of new intimacy with Sweden, and how the logistical issues of surging and reinforcing would be met. So not just the weapons technology is important, but things like road networks and airfields, access, and hybrid warfare is a squishy term, and it can be used irresponsibly, shall we say. So I'm more interested in a less than formal war situation in which all of these factors of new technology and capability could come into play in ways that would be hard for us to respond to.
Without a doubt, Michael. And at the Center for Excellence on Countering Hybrid Threats, I asked, well, how are different countries performing here? And the answer was, Well, some are in just the response stage, others are in the deterrent stage, and more need to be in the deterrent stage. And I said, well, it sounds like a good think tank report to highlight the laggards and the leaders when it comes to hybrid threats. And of course, the countries that are closest to Russia, we all know this, are the ones that are taking it more seriously. But I will also tell you, when I said that Russia was dragging anchors in the Gulf of Finland, the response from someone in Finland was, "Well, we don't know for certain yet whether it's the Russians." And I thought, "Are you kidding me?" I mean, I was really shocked by the reluctance of a senior person in Finland to say that it was Russian. And so that gave me pause for thinking about how ready people were to respond to what is an incredibly effective approach by the Russians. I also asked a couple of people, what is the um, level of receptivity for Russian propaganda, information operations, disinformation in Finland? Because it came up in other discussions, and they said, "Well, look, in Finland, there's no audience for it." They pointed out two individuals who are in Russia who do have a few hundred followers, and they are true believers in the Russian position on Ukraine and on Europe, but that they had almost no traction inside of Finland, and obviously, it's Finland's history.
It's the conceptualization of scenarios. What do not just Finns, but everyone, including yourself, how would you imagine Russia would uh, um, unfold a hybrid warfare scenario? What sort of things would they do?
Well, sabotage, number one, and shaping the information environment alongside that. What they've been doing, and we see all the examples, the attacks inside Poland, the drones, the incursions into airspace, the dragging of the anchors, the cyber attacks, these would just be expanded. I can't tell you what would be new among those types of approaches, but it would just be massively expanded, and the Russians have the ability to do it. So I met with the Greek ambassador in Kyiv on my last visit there, and I talked to him about Greece's position and what they were doing to support Ukraine, and he said, quietly, "We're doing as much as we can, but in northern Greece, we have a huge contingent and community of Russians. And when the war kicked off, they were activated right away. In previous political disputes in southeastern Europe, the Russians, we saw them, we heard them, um, you know, it, initiating activities among this Russian community in northern Greece. So this is what I imagine they would do: is when it called upon, when it's needed, the Russians would simply, inject additional money, energy, pressure into their communities across Europe, and then act on these.
Russian minorities in, as you know, of course, Latvia and Estonia. So one of the scenarios there, for example, would be a Russian claim to protect the minorities,
Yeah.
and so it wouldn't be a full scale aggression or attack, but it would be a kind of incrementalism, what they used to call salami slicing. Is there anything comparable with Finland in terms of claims or ways that they would stake out something much more aggressive than simply the below the radar things like sabotage?
Nothing came up, but what's in the air with your question is, what is the level of threat that the Finns feel for the Russians? And I asked that both there and when I returned, and they said, look, we are not worried that the Russians are going to reconstitute this force on the border and then invade Finland, because we are a harder target than than Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. But nonetheless, they said, we are on guard and we are building capabilities for this possibility, because 1939 and 40 is not that far in the rearview mirror for us. Okay, and it's a sense of national pride, and it's why we have 900,000 people who are mobilized today, and why everyone's going in for a year of service between age 19 and 26. So I will say that they weren't at red alert status, but they were, a warm orange, thinking that, okay, we need to make sure that we are never the point of entry for Russian forces. But they did not feel it was imminent in any way, or even in the 5 to 10 year uh, frame.
And just to continue that, and then we have multiple questions over here, but just kind of very briefly. Um, I mean, is there kind of an escalation pathway related to the dragging of the anchors? And then, there has been sort of a more, let's call it assertive response, on the part of some of the regional countries to that behavior, and helicoptering out to the ships,
Yeah.
and all of that.
Yeah.
The Russians are, certainly in parallel, kind of angry at the United States about the shadow fleet activity, but not really in a position where the United States is concerned that they want to directly confront that. Uh,
Yeah.
is there like a pathway there that anybody is worried about, escalatory?
Absolutely. They feel that the Russians can simply dial up the activity, going back to your question, of all of these capabilities within the hybrid warfare realm. On the escalation pathways, we are in early days of Europeans coming out of this Cold War dependency on the United States of being the ones to always lead any kinetic effort. And to be the most powerful operator in Europe, in where countries are actually starting to think, what will we do in the absence of the United States with an increased, footprint and degree of activity by the Russians in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea, et cetera. So this notion of, is there an escalatory ladder there that is met by the Europeans in Northeast Europe is still a very fresh new topic. I would say only a year old because of Trump's return to office. Yeah.
I think we have a couple directly on this point.
Go ahead. Yeah, on the point of
And sorry if I could ask everybody.
that's
Yeah,
offensive original.
yeah.
On the point of hybrid warfare, don't you think it would be a major mistake for Russia to accelerate this? Because right now they've had enormous success with political warfare. They've got Hungary jamming up everything. They've got President Trump jamming up everything. They've got people with deep financial interest in Russia negotiating with the United States. If they push that, they feed into this reaction from Europe that we've got to do something. So doesn't it make more sense for them to stay on the political track as long as they're winning there, and they are pretty clearly?
Yes. Things are
definitely
definitely going
going
well
well.
for them in that respect, and you point those things out. And Trump's disposition on Russia is clearly, emboldening them. Um, it's still hard for me to think about Europeans being aggressive in the face of a dialed up Russian hybrid warfare against them. But we are seeing it. This boarding of the ship by the Finns, if you saw the 60 Minutes piece, was the first time they did that since World War II. But the Finns are serious about this, as are their friends and neighbors right across the Bay of or Gulf of Finland. Um, Again, it's still I'm still in the mindset. I'm 55 years old. I grew up at the end of the Cold War, and I still see this as something that the US has to lead because of the respect and fear that the Russians would have of the US military response and not of a Nordic response or of a Central European response, which is our weak spot in the alliance, as you point out. Um, so would the Russians make a mistake by dialing it up when they have all these other advantages? Putin is a supreme operator. I think he would only do that if he felt he needed to, had an opening, had an advantage to be gained by that. He doesn't make many mistakes.
Okay. And then we had.
I can wait my turn. It's on the nuclear dimension.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right. Let's come down here, then up here, then back to you. Tor, I think you had a.
So
Following.
I just wanted to comment briefly on Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO. That's really been a game changer for Nordic defense cooperation, which has been closed for decades, of course. But it has huge implications in terms of sharing classified information, planning, joint exercises, and so forth. So that's been really a game changer for Nordic defense cooperation. Also, you mentioned logistics. That's absolutely key. So Norway is investing heavily in infrastructure, so road and rail, etc.
Yeah.
So the focus has gone from just receiving allied reinforcements to sending them on as eastwards.
You have that road network that you're building. That's very impressive.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't want to go into the details, but
No.
that's there. So we're investing heavily, and that goes towards the 5% goal as well, of course. So it's beyond 3% or 3.5. It's part of the 1.5%. Also on resilience, more generally, I think that's a key point because I think the Nordic countries overall are extremely resilient. There's high trust in institutions. There is reasonable homogeneity. There is a low level of conflict, and generally speaking, we're not all that vulnerable to Russian propaganda and other types of hybrid attempts. That's not saying that those attempts are not happening. There is a low level hybrid campaign that is being waged basically 24/7. So that's just the fact. So it's just some key points.
Up here, then there, over here. So, in response to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, Russia announced that they would change the Leningrad military district, including sending and stationing more troops to the Republic of Karelia, which actually has that onerous border with Finland. We also heard reporting that Russia uses fighter jets from the military airfield near Petrozavodsk, which is a major in the region, to support some of the ships that raise questions among the Baltic states. So I wondered if you heard things, raising concerns about this military plans, or since there is so much change in military technology, this is no longer relevant. How many fighter jets Russia would have in the Republic of Karelia, or how many military, ships are there?
Sure. So the quick answer is they are still concerned about the aircraft, without a doubt. But it is a fluid environment, as we know, and as you point out. And so I felt that the Finns had a perspective of a 360-degree view of what the threats could be. As I mentioned, my absolute last line of my comments was a multidimensional view of what threats are. Within the military threat, they felt that, all options were on the table in terms of what they could be facing. The folks I met with at NDU Finland were really good on this in the positioning of the Russian forces and what that force mixture would look like. They're doing what they can to monitor it. They obviously have a very solid military, and they can't spend their money on all potential options. But yeah, they still felt that aircraft was of great concern.
So thank you for the presentation. I'm Robert Benson of the Center for Progress. My question's on the nuclear dimension. So you being close to the Cold Peninsula, right, in the center of Russian nuclear activity in Murmansk, to the extent that the discussions veered there, and then also coming after Munich, this idea of a lack of trust in the American nuclear deterrent. We've heard that time and time again, coming from the Germans and the French. And I believe it was the Swedish Institute for like Atomic Science or one of the Scandinavian think tanks put out a paper about a Nordic bomb. Are we at that point?
Well, at the point of considering it or actually, moving forward with some program? I'll answer the question myself. No, we're not. It did not come up once, this notion. But certainly the notion of deterrence and nuclear umbrella, was mentioned, but certainly no discussion of any capability in Scandinavia. But I want to hammer in again, back to a couple of comments. This notion that the U.S. is not there to be relied on anymore has pushed other NATO members to think about what the future is like with an unreliable United States, even post-Trump. And that race that's begun, or that movement forward, is super uneven. And there just are countries that are moving forward that don't need any other signal, and then there are others who are saying, "Oh my God, let's go back to what we had," and they're barely making any moves. Spain, Um, and so, it's just obviously I've been spending time in the eastern part of Europe for the last couple of years, and everyone there is as serious as can be. Not everyone, but most of the countries are very serious about it. But back to your point about how ready and capable would European NATO members be to confront a dialed up hybrid threat. Um, I still think a lot of them are in this Cold War hangover of still hoping the United States comes out of this funk, and I just don't think that that's going to happen, even if a Democrat, takes the White House or a traditional Republican, takes the White House next time. I feel that they realize that the past is the past and that they have to reposition themselves. And that concept, that feeling, they're just out of the womb on that. They are just now looking at this new world through an infant's eyes and thinking, where do we go from here? So it is really new, this notion of what do we do with a group of Nordic states? What do we do with a group of Central European states, with Western European states? This is still super fluid as to how they would constitute themselves, what their disposition would be, how aggressive they would be on, you know, a multi-ship anchor drag operation or intrusions of airspace. This is literally weeks and months old in their minds. And I heard that from the Finns, but from other in this room that I've had discussions with your colleagues, it's still just um, they're not yet steady footed on what they're going to do, which is really distressing, by the way.
I'm John Seward with the Washington Times. Apologize for my tardiness, slight disheveled appearance. I just got back from the Arctic warfare training in Fairbanks last night. So, but a key part of that came up that I want to sort of broach to the group, especially our Nordic partners here. Um, Sustainment across force, especially across NATO, became a massive challenge, specifically between the US and the Canadians conducting operations there. And they were very well integrated, very well planned. And so this idea of continued sort of NATO support, especially through Finland and Sweden, and obviously with our partners in Norway, like what what's the consideration for just how long an Arctic fake would actually take? I mean, from the U.S. perspective, right? We have this attitude of we show up, we get the job done, and we leave, even though we spent 20 years in the Middle East, right? But just in day-to-day operations in those sorts of conditions, whether in the winter because of the cold or whether in the summer because of the mud, took essentially 4 to 5 times as long, which means 4 to 5 times as much sustainment to be able to actually conduct those operations. So just what does that support structure actually look like that you mentioned toward the 5% actually going more towards logistics? And I just want to sort of open that challenge.
Yeah, and I'm happy to have others weigh in here. The notion of sustainment and how long, Nordic forces could hold out with or without U.S. support. We didn't get that deep on this discussion with the military officers. But I will point out that when my colleague Johnny Harris went on maneuvers with this Finnish platoon, I think it was a platoon size. These were all 19-year-olds, and this was a war game against really professional, seasoned US and NATO forces. And this was home court advantage, and they definitely did better, he said. They clearly did better. So that goes to the issue of sustainment and the ability to slow down an incoming Russian army that, going back to the Winter War, but looking at today, would also have similar problems, even if they were on paper a better military force, more capable, better sustained than the Finnish force. But Finns have an excellent program of supply and motivation and training. Um, so that's all I could gather from what I saw and what I heard. But we just didn't get that deep on sustainment.
Morgan. I'm the Arctic Security Officer at the U.S. Department of State. Um, to what degree, if any, I recognize this is not the focus of your presentation, but to what degree, if any, did China come up in your conversations?
One of the EU scholars I met with was a China expert. who's also a reservist. And so he came along with the Russian military expert from NDU, and I asked about China, in their perspective. Well, his comment was, "I'm surprised China is tolerating Russia's level of disruption to the global system, or at least to the global system as it operates in Europe. That because the Chinese benefit so much more from the current global system than the Russians do, we all know that. Even if they think it's an unfair structure, they are benefiting massively from it trade-wise. Um, that they've always been less about rocking the boat than the Russians are. And when I was in China for fellowship and subsequently, the Chinese would always say to me, we want to see you in rough seas. The Russians want to see you at the bottom of the ocean. That's the difference between us. Um, the comment from this China expert was, we're surprised the Chinese are tolerating rougher seas with the Russian activity, with attacks on infrastructure, and just how disruptive and callous they've been. And then I went and asked someone else about that, and they said um, that they didn't feel that the Russians were at some sort of tipping point with the Chinese, and that the Chinese have the whip hand. We all know that in this relationship, and ultimately they can get the Russians to dial down some of that activity if they see it as a threat to China's position. So that's how it came up, and I thought that was the most interesting point, that the Finns were, and it was more than just the NDU point of contact, but that other Finns were surprised that the Chinese were allowing the Russians to be as disruptive as they are without exerting some pressure on them.
Michael.
We all want to be as positive as we can in terms of how we respond. I mean, that's our bread and butter. But could you possibly imagine, and I'm asking seriously now, could you possibly imagine a change in what used to be called traditionally the balance of power, or more contemporary terms, a shift in the strategic situation in Europe that would lead Finland to experience buyer's remorse concerning NATO?
Yeah. That's interesting. So at my February 11 talk, where several ambassadors were present, um, and where Johnny Harris was also present, among his interviews and my discussions was on the street and then at government level, do you regret joining NATO? How do you feel about that? No one regretted joining NATO. They were all positive on it, but several regretted losing the status of a neutral nation.
Yeah.
Was the point. So we're happy. We've been, silent NATO partners forever. I mean, look what happened. As soon as the wall comes down, order for 46 F-18s by the Finns, right? They clearly signaled this is the direction we're going. That was, you know, 30 plus years ago. So there's always been this sense of, hey, that's our team. But, several people said, it was kind of nice to be in the position we were. But, after Ukraine, 2014 and 2022, I think a lot of that melted away. And I don't just think that, that's what I heard. It's what Johnny's interviews revealed as well.
Imagination was what I was trying to tap into. There
Yeah.
are always worst case scenarios that change the picture and thus change feelings in a dramatic fashion. And certainly that could happen. We don't like to think about it, and we're afraid of even mentioning it because that might indicate that we think that could happen. But that isn't the purpose of worst case scenarios. It's to think through the dynamics of the situation in their entirety, not simply focus on how we can do good stuff. So what would your imagination tell you?
About the buyer's remorse. What would lead to that? Well, the complete abandonment of NATO by the United States. And there's been enough rhetoric from Trump about that to generate some concern among Finns and others that, wow, we joined this alliance that had the US nuclear umbrella and the US military, conventional military, at the vanguard of this alliance. And now you have not only the White House, but several Republicans in Congress talking about, dialing that back. So yes, that is the scenario in which you could experience buyer's remorse on the part of Sweden and Finland, and maybe even some of the more recent accession members. But um, Finns specifically, took pride in being a leader among NATO members now. They know that the Russians are unhappy to have a NATO member at the border as they are, but there was not a sort of like sense that they were in the wilderness and acting alone. But what happened at Davos and all the comments coming out of the White House clearly do not help. That's stating the obvious.
And Michael, it just seems to me, just as a comment, that intellectually, what it would require, in the way that Tom is talking about, it would require the United States disengaging, and then also a sense that other Europeans weren't kind of stepping up. There's not like a European nuclear umbrella that's extended. There's not,
The discussion of it.
well, I'm
France.
just talking about kind of a scenario, and then you get into a situation if you're Finland or somebody else who joined recently. Will Europe protect me sufficiently, or am I better off, cutting a deal with Russia? I mean, that's kind of what's required, isn't it?
Thinking of what most of us would consider an unlikely event, but one that's nonetheless possible, and that would be a great Russian victory in Ukraine. And that would, combined with the recession of U.S. commitment, is a kind of a double whammy, and I should not be discounting.
Sorry. Well, we had one over here. Yes.
Stick pure sum the DCM of Denmark. I had to come up with a. I know we're on the record here, but I disagree. I mean, with any buyer's remorse, I have to say, I don't see this happening. I mean, you'll be sitting here in the US. You are obviously a bit detached. So am I. I've been gone for 3 years, so I'm not saying I have the latest, but I think there's been a fundamental change in Europe towards the US that you shouldn't underestimate. And we had 3 more years of this administration, and we have another one coming after. We don't know what we're going to see. So, and this is more also a private observation, but things have changed. The sentiment back home from US colleagues I talked to who travel there, with US decision makers going there, Congress senators with lots of coattails going. I mean, it's changed, and I don't see any alternative. I fail to see what Russia has to offer. So we ended together, and I think I mean, I heard some, the Nordic nuclear bomb and all. I mean, I saw, but I wouldn't, it's it was a joke. I don't think it's anymore. I'm not saying we are there at all. I mean, but we are quite advanced. I'm not saying we have those capability, but we could do it quite easily if we wanted to. And I think it takes more to do so. I'm a crappy deal in Ukraine where we know that Russia will be back, and with a disengagement from the US is one way to put it. Could be a possibility. I don't know. I don't think we want to be that kind of countries. It's not just having the capability. You need everything else to lift it, to test it, and all that. It's I don't know where we should begin. But I think I see the meetings that the prime ministers have, the Nordic prime ministers. They were usually kind of culture and language change. Now it's hardcore, security policy. It's changed. It's changed, and it's not going to come back. I don't think any leadership in Denmark now thinks they will be back and will have a Biden saying all the right stuff. I don't think so. Things has changed fundamentally. I have to, sadly, I'm a big transatlantic. My son was born here. I've been here, but I don't see that. I think something has changed fundamentally between us, and we need to find a new kind of relationship. And I think it's right. That's rightful. So we should do more, and we're doing more. And to spice it up in Denmark, we have Greenland issue, and it's just been destroying everything. And I think looking back at Trump 1, the European integration took huge step forward. And I think we'll see the same now when historians are going to see Trump 2, what did it do to European integration? And we'll have different speeds. I think, Spain has its own, they're far away from Russia. It's not that existential. But for us in the Nordics, in the Eastern European Baltics, it's and I don't think they get it really in that position right now. So to be honest,
Like sort of the metaphor I use is a fight in a relationship. This is the morning after. It is early days. There wasn't a breakup, but there was this realization of, wow, that was a bad fight we had last night, and things are different moving forward. What is ahead is what's the mystery, because it is so early in European restructuring and rethinking about, okay, how do we move forward with an uncertain US partner here? Trump or no Trump, it's the level of uncertainty is high enough now that we need to reconfigure our posture.
I mean, the phrase that I use, I guess, is, history only moves in one direction. And I think everybody is a little bit grappling with that. So we have one here and then one here. Sir.
CSBA. In your thinking about the Finnish military is going to be primarily concerned with defense of Finland, first and foremost, right? Was there any discussion of how the Finns might contribute if the Russians made an armed attack, say, on Estonia and Latvia? Well, given both the capabilities and the proximity.
Well, if the attack were on Estonia, I'd be very surprised if the Finns did not support Estonia.
But militarily.
Oh yeah, that's what I mean. No, we did not discuss that as a scenario, but given the proximity, the linguistic and cultural and other ties between the countries, the communications cables, the energy sharing, et cetera. My statement, my view on that is, of course, the Finnish military would support the Estonians, but we don't know what the scenario would be. Well, they are a NATO member, so they most certainly are thinking about.
Level of NATO will defend. I'm saying, at the Finnish military base, are they thinking about specific military operations or contingency plans that they might possibly put to effect if there is such an attack? Because NATO political decision making is incredibly slow.
Yeah. Sure. So the specific scenario did not come up. I did not, offer that as a question to them. So I'm only going on, what I learned from this visit in my ongoing engagement with the embassy and other folks in NATO. Of course, the Article 5 commitment is there. Estonia is Estonia. How many times Ambassador Mikkola referred to Ambassador Prick as her brother during our lunch dinner discussion a couple of weeks ago, highlights just that kind of thinking between those two particular countries. So I would be very surprised if Finland military did not show up to help defend Estonia. Kinetically, militarily, not, sending ammunition, sending some kind of other support, but actually being there on the ground. Now, that's just my assessment. I'd be very surprised if anything other than that happened.
We have actually all three people, I think, in a row here with questions or comments. We have 7 minutes. So let's just take those sequentially, and
Sure.
then Tom, you respond first here, then there, then TX, you last.
Just maybe echoing the comments from our Danish counterpart. The rupture does seem to be fairly acute. In the mind of the most committed Atlanticist in the Baltic states, in Scandinavia, right? In Poland, where are they on these critical questions of the Europeanization of NATO, on defense procurement? I mean, did any of these debates happening on the continent come up? And then where do you assess them, if you will, on these questions?
And then, sorry.
Yeah. Think across the Lithuanian embassy. Well, kind of to add to the previously raised questions on the scenario if Finland's forces are thinking about moving outside of Finnish territory to in case of conflict to support other allies. So I do understand that you don't have direct answer and maybe didn't discuss, but what about the issue which might indirectly indicate that issue of military mobility? Have you discussed that? Are they thinking on how the possible support from allies could arrive to Finland, thinking on logistics, thinking on supplies, and also thinking on their own mobility in case if that be needed. Thank you.
Yeah, the discussion on Spain, this is an old problem for NATO. The southwest states are looking south for immigration, northeast states are looking at Russia. It would seem that Russia, if they really wanted to do hybrid warfare, would once again go back to heavily stimulating migration. And they have some assets in Africa to do that in Sahel. With the loss of Syria, they don't have as much leverage in the Middle East. But has there been concern about that? That the way to split NATO is something along that line, rather than actually attacking within NATO, which tends to unify NATO.
Okay. Okay, your question, the first one, where are they in the discussion of Europeanization of NATO? Oh, it was in almost every discussion. I mean, again, this is literally 3 days after Davos, and the comments about NATO not showing up on the front lines in Afghanistan, et cetera. By the way, Estonia, Denmark are in the top 5 for per capita killed during in Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, yes, it was in every discussion because it was in the headlines. And this wasn't the first time Trump had made statements about a weak commitment to NATO, but it was so emotional and so raw because of Greenland, because of the comments about hiding from the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the uncertainty that the U.S. was not going to be there for an Article 5 commitment. So the discussions were there, but again, this is the morning after. We are really in the early stages with, Germany responding with budget changes, with Nordic states talking about coming together to, have essentially a coalition within NATO. So the discussions are there, but the pace of movement in this direction is obviously very slow. But it was at a heightened level of discussion because of what had just happened over Greenland and at Davos. So I'm encouraged by it. At the same time, I'm very sad that Europeans even have to have the discussion. Um, I like the idea that NATO is spending more, that NATO is thinking about a more aggressive disposition towards hybrid warfare and towards kinetic warfare. I just don't like the way it was generated through this incredibly insulting, disruptive, unnecessary approach by President Trump. But I am happy that it is on the table as a discussion point in almost every discussion I'm having, and that Europeans are thinking about it. I just wish they were thinking about it because in isolation, they see the Russian threat, not because they don't have the US as on their flank for this or leading at the vanguard. I just wish NATO was doing this because of what's happening in Ukraine on the hot war side and because of what's happening in Europe with the hybrid threat, but it is largely prompted by the US attitude towards NATO. Um, Finland going abroad to defend others. What about mobility and supply of Finland? Well, I think forward land forces is an effort to look at bringing more capability into Finland. These are good. These are exercises involving 1,000 people, but but that's still a good development. And the Finns weren't about to get into the specifics of sustainment, resupply, et cetera, for a potential war with the Russians. But it was clear that with FLF with NATO accession with Arctic Sentry. Again, in the very earliest days with Arctic Sentry, that Finland was an integrated part, that resupply was something they were focusing on, but nothing deeper than that. Third question, NATO, Spain looking south.
Migration, weaponizing
Yeah.
migration.
We saw what happened with Belarus. We saw what happened on the Hungarian and Polish borders. We saw what happened with the instrumentalized migration on the Finnish border. And we saw the massive disruption in the subsequent rise of AfD in Germany because of the million asylees that came into Germany. So I don't know why the Russians would not consider that as an option in the future, to continue to push asylum seekers from the Sahel, which is where 51% of all terrorism deaths occurred in 2024, under now, in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, where the Russians have a very strong presence. It's an area that I'm also working in and visiting. So they have this capability to do that. But so much is just, we're discussing things here that we all know are possibilities, but much of it depends on what happens in Ukraine, what happens with the White House and solidifying our position on NATO and European security. So a lot of things are still fluid, up in the air, which from an intellectual and scholarly side makes this very interesting. But from a force planning, alliance building, sustainment side is really upsetting and disruptive.
We're at 10:01, and I see a couple of our guests want to make comments. Let's just keep them very brief. We want to let everybody go, please.
Mistake from the Danish embassy again. So I have to disagree again. I don't think we'll see. I mean, the risk is there for mass migration or migration using that as a tool, but it's a different Europe today. We have things. It's in 2015. I agree. It was totally open, but now I think more or less all European countries have their own kind of border procedures in place. It maybe if something collapses with Turkey and we have it, I mean, it could be. I don't see it happening now. Even Sweden has just introduced even tougher migration law than us. Things are changing, in Europe. Has been changing since the last 10 years.
I don't see this as a major issue or capability on the horizon. I'm just simply saying it's happened in multiple countries. And I think yeah, I never think anything is set in stone. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Annalisa, Estonian Embassy. And sorry I didn't take the floor earlier. I think I was just a little bit still recovering from the fact that we celebrated Estonia's Independence Day yesterday. So, which, I mean, as everyone knows, since 2022 also coincides with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then, yesterday, 4th anniversary. So definitely a somber mark we're at. I just wanted to kind of also wrap up the discussion by saying that thanks, Tom, you did a great job representing Estonia also in discussion. And, I had many times when I was thinking what to say, because in a way the Finnish and the Estonia models are so similar. I didn't want to just, double tap on everything you said. I think only other thing I'll add right now is that, of course, Estonia, Baltics, Nordic Baltics, we're at high alert status, but always finding the fine balance of not being in a panic mode, not getting ahead of ourselves in again in a panicky way, but it's more important to stay vigilant, prepare, raise our own resilience, do all of the homework in that sense. And also, about the question of okay, what happens if, and Russia either again dial up the hybrid and the cyber attacks. That definitely also to mention. I think by this point, we have seen it all, in the sense that the range of incidents has been so broad, and if they were to I mean, God forbid, like really like, come across the border. I think our former chief of defense has been very clear about this, that at this point we are at the point of we will just like shoot them all, you know? So we are dead serious about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we had a very rich and wide-ranging conversation here. A lot of really important issues. Jan, I think, raised a particularly important question, which to me seems like something really to watch in the future, which is, who is doing sort of what advanced planning individually and maybe collectively in a way that doesn't rely on the United States kind of being the quarterback, if you will.
Yeah.
That seems to me like a really interesting thing to watch. But
Yeah.
Tom, thank you so much for a great presentation, and thank you all.
Great. Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. Great questions. Sorry, I can't answer all of them. Happy to connect on LinkedIn. QR code is there on my business card here. But thank you for everyone's comments and your commitment to the topic.
Thank you. Thank you.